Aloha and welcome to this screencast on play forms. This is about the most simple I could make play form processing as an introduction. When you read the book or go through the tutorials, what you're going to find is that in an effort to try to show you how cool play is, they tend to wrap up form processing in the model and even maybe database persistence, which actually is a cool part of play. But my experience is it makes it much more difficult to kind of unwrap problems when they occur. So I'm kind of taking a different approach in this class. It means that what I'm about to show you is going to differ a lot from what you're going to read in the book. But my hope is that you should definitely read what you see in the book, and then when you look at this, and then go back to the book, you're going to start to see that I'm really talking about the same concepts, but kind of coming from a different place. And my hope is that you'll have this huge epiphany and get it. Because once you get it, form processing is really, it's really not rocket science. It's actually pretty simple. But there is kind of this conceptual, kind of hurdle you have to get over to get the concepts into your head. Okay, and so my goal is that this is the smallest, tiniest little step that I can create to get you over that hurdle. Let's see if it works. I think it will. So let's pretend that we have this mock-up of a form. Hopefully you've seen this quite recently, right? This is a very simple little web app. There's this new contact page. It's got a form in it. Everything looks good, right? Simple, the most simple form you can imagine, just 3 strings. How hard could it be, right? Okay, so in order to implement that, if you're just doing it as a mock-up, you're going to end up with some HTML and some Twitter Bootstrap code because, why would anyone ever create a web app without using Twitter Bootstraps? Unknown answer. I don't have the answer to that, but so here we have our form, and you can see that it uses the form element. It's raw HTML, and what we want to do now is we want to connect. If you just click the add button on this, nothing's going to actually happen because there's no connection to our actual backend database. So the basic question is, what is the play way to create a form that actually works, in the sense that in the backend in your Java code you can actually do things with the form data once the user presses add. Okay? And so the answer comes in 4 parts. And there's many different ways you can answer this question. I'm answering it in what I hope is going to be the smallest possible conceptual hurdle for you to get over in order to be building forms. And you'll be able to go a surprisingly long way with this, as it turns out. So what I want to say is you're going to create what I'm going to call is a backing class for the form. And by backing, I mean that you've got this form on the front side, and on the back side there's this Java class, which is basically kind of the Java version of that form. Okay, the second thing you do, you're going to make your view template, that new contact.scala.html file that presented that form along with all that Twitter Bootstrap stuff. You're going to make that dynamic, okay, and that's going to involve introducing some Scala code into your template, which is Scala code that's implemented by the Play framework to do dynamic stuff. Okay. The third thing we're going to have to do is, in our controller, we've got to now be able to process this form data as it comes in. So we're going to make some modifications to our controller code. And then finally, and most simply, we add to our routes file a post request, because that's what forms do. They create post requests to the server. So let's go through each of these 4 answers now in detail. Okay? First part is this backing class. Okay? What do I mean by that? Turns out this is super simple. Okay? What you do is you're going to create a class. By convention for this class, in my own personal Play programming style, I put it in the views package because it is really connected to the views, but I'm going to create a subpackage of views called form data, and that's where I'm going to put these backing classes because they're Java classes that support form data. I'm going to put it in a subclass of views because I like having my views package just contain those Scala template files. And I don't want to like mix up Java code with Scala templates. That just seems, you know, crufty to me. Okay, so we have this views form data package, and in it, here's an example of a backing class, and they don't get really much more complicated than this. Okay, it's going to be a public class. It's going to have public fields. And I'm going to take it back. It does get a little more complicated than this once we add validation, which I'll do in a future screencast. But they're still not complicated in any really way. All right. So we're going to have this contact form data class, and we're just going to have public fields, fields, okay, that correspond to each of the input fields in our form. So in our form, we had 3 inputs, a first name, a last name, and telephone. We've got 3 strings here that correspond to those. You know, if you had a multi-selection box, you'd have a list of strings, but otherwise, you know, it's not going to be really any more complicated than that. You want to make sure that you know, each of these strings is given a default value of an empty string. That kind of tends to help things. And also, I want to note that this violates our Java style conventions. Generally, you want to make sure that all fields are private, and then you have accessors. But this backing class is a special class that has to have these public accessors because of the way the nature of the Play framework works. And that's one of the reasons why I stick these in their own package and kind of view them specially, because otherwise I find this to be a horrific, you know, a horrific violation of software engineering best practices for the last 20 years. But in this specific case, it's a good idea. It simplifies things. It allows Play to do what it needs to do. And, you know, you're not going to really get bugs from doing it in this specific circumstance because the semantics of this are so clean and simple. Okay, so that's what you have to do. Okay. Second thing is we have, once we've got our backing class, we have to make the view dynamic. And that's going to have kind of 3 parts to it. We have to be able to send in our form data. So for example, we might want to pre-fill that form with information. And so we have to be able to send form data into the template. And that's going to be done by adding a parameter. We're going to have to replace this HTML syntax, the angle bracket form angle bracket, with a Scala template function called @form. Okay, and that will expand into that HTML form template, but it's going to provide some other useful properties like where the post actually goes to. The third thing is in each of our inputs, we want to make certain attributes dynamic provided by the form data, okay? And so it's basically going to be the ID, the value, and the name fields are generally the first 3 that you want to make dynamic. And so that means instead of just hard coding an ID of last, we're going to have the ID be the contact form, which is this parameter that we sent in. Given the entire form, we're going to find the last field attribute of it and select the ID value of that. So let's see how this looks in practice. You can see a form here that has, if I go to the top, okay, we've got, this is the parameter. So we used to have strings, which were just some kind of message that we'd pass in. We're getting rid of those now because we can actually pass something useful. So we've got a parameter, it's named it's named contact form. And then the type of that is a form. And then in Scala land, you use these brackets versus the angle brackets. In Java, you would think of this as being an angle bracket. In Scala, you just think of it, you just use the bracket. Syntactic change for whatever reason. And then we just have the basic fully qualified Java class name here. Okay, the very first line of a view template, it should start with the @ that defines the parameters, okay, to this particular Java class, which is going to be generated through the expansion of this Scala, template thing. The next thing we're going to do is we have to have this @import helper because we need to be able to, because this particular package in Scala land is going to provide definitions for this @form template, which now appears, which is replacing our angle bracket form HTML tag. Okay, and this will expand into that angle bracket HTML form tag, but it's also going to indicate where, when you press the submit button, you want the data to go. And we do that via this thing called reverse routing, which is kind of cool. So we're going to specify basically here, we're just going to specify what's that controller method that we want to have invoked, and then the play will take care of figuring out what the URL is that should be, because in the ultimate HTML code, you're going to have a URL. You're not going to have, you know, a reference to a Java class. And then if you remember, there was an attribute that Twitter Bootstrap wanted. Okay, let's just go back here. Twitter Bootstrap wanted in this form, they wanted class equals form horizontal. It had this role thing, that's optional. I didn't put that in. You could just in the same way. But this was really essential, that we have this class equals form horizontal. So the way that you can do that with this form primitive is basically have an apostrophe, the name of the attribute, and then this right arrow thingy, you know, a hyphen and a right angle bracket, followed by a string indicating the value that you wanted the attribute to have. So all this is going to do is end up just putting in this class equals form horizontal into our, into the actual HTML code that will be generated at runtime. Okay, so there's that at form that replaces the open form tag, but there's also a close form tag that has to be at the bottom, and basically you're going to put a right curly brace where that closing form tag was. Okay, so if we go here, you can see there's at the very bottom of this, there's this closing form tag element. Okay, we just replaced that line of code in our file with this closing brace that matches this opening brace up here, and that's how Scala, when it's going to basically create that open form tag element, put all this junk, HTML junk inside, and then at the end of it, it's going to expand out and put the closing form element for you. Okay. Okay, and then the only other thing you want to do to make your view dynamic is in each of your input fields, you're now replacing hard-coded references to name, ID, we didn't even have value in our current one, with references to the form. Okay, so this is, again, pretty simple. You'll recall from your readings, you probably noticed at points that they talked about, okay, anytime you have something that start, you know, the @ sign is going to indicate the start of a Scala invocation inside your view template. So you see these @ signs everywhere we want to do that. You know, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. But down here, what we're going to say is inside our, you know, our name string, okay, because we have an open quote and then we have the close quote at the end, we're going to have this Scala expression, which is going to be contact form, which is our parameter, which is the entire form. And then out of that, we're going to pass it a value, which is simply just the name of the field that we're interested in. Okay, so first name. So they're going to use a little bit of reflection here to get that, if you know about Java reflection. And then once we have that field, it turns out that forms attach certain properties to that, and the Scala form, you know, utility attaches properties. So we're going to get the name attribute of that first name field in our form object. ID will do the similar thing, and value will do the similar thing. And there's other stuff that you'll see later that we can do with these fields, these form fields. But for now, that's all we need. And this exact same thing with this second input. We're using the last name. And then for the telephone, we just use the telephone. So if you recall from our template, we have a first name, last name, and telephone fields. And then when you go into our dynamic invocation, we're talking about those exact fields: first name, last name, telephone. Okay? And there you have it, right? So we're going to add a parameter up here that indicates the form that we want to have, you know, manipulated dynamically. We're going to use this Scala template to indicate where the form should be processed by, or who the form should be processed by in our controller. We're going to add some Twitter Bootstrap stuff. Then we got a bunch of Twitter Bootstrap stuff in the middle. You'll notice a lot of redundancy here, and you might be asking yourself, gee, could I replace that redundancy? And absolutely, there's very simple Scala templates you can define to clean this up quite a bit. We're not going to do it now because I'm trying to show you the simplest possible modification to get to where we want to go. But it's certainly possible to make this code cleaner. And by the end of the semester, you'll be doing that no problem. Okay, part 3 of the basic answers, we need to handle the form in the controller. That means we have to modify the get part of the method to pass an empty form into that view, because the view, remember, now requires a parameter that is of type form views form data.contact form data. So both when we try to display this page for the first time, this form is going to require, and then we'll get a compiler error if we don't do it. It's required to pass in a form object, and then when we post the data, we're going to in our post controller, we're going to want to be able to get that form data and manipulate it. Okay, so let's see how that works. Here's our controller. Homepage just like it used to be. Remember, we're passing a string, but the pages that deal with that new contact page, here's our old one that was the code that would support just displaying of the blank page. Now what we do is we use this play framework stuff. Okay, it's just play framework stuff. You have to learn it. Where what we're going to do is we're going to take our backing class. We're going to take our backing class, contact form data.class. We're going to pass it to this form utility method of the form class. Okay, that's in the play.data.form package. And what that's going to return is an object of type form of contact form data. Okay, so now we've got this form object in play world. Okay, and what you'll notice is that form angle bracket contact form data turns out to look almost exactly the same as the type here in our template, except here it's form with a angle bracket rather than a curly bracket. So there's just that's just a syntactic difference between Scala, parameterized type syntax, and the Java version. Okay, but otherwise they're identically equal, right? So you make that consistent that way, and then instead of returning OK with index.render or new contact.render a string, we're going to return OK with the page that we want render and this actual form object. So now we're passing that blank, that empty, that default version of contact form data. I guess inside here, what's going to happen is it's going to call the new. It's going to use reflection to call new instance, I guess, and make a new instance of this contact form data. Okay, and pass that into the new contact page, and then it will render everything appropriately. So that's what happens when you request the page for the first time and you just want a blank form. Now, what happens when you actually have typed some form data in and you want the play framework to deal with it? Well, in that case, you have to write a new controller method, which I'm going to call post contact, referring to the post HTTP operation. And I have a system out print line just to show, so you can actually see in the play console when you've actually entered this method. And but you don't have to have that there. Obviously, it's a debugging statement, so you're going to take it out actually. And then you're going to have this is play syntax. So we're going to start off with this form.form contact form data. That's exactly the same as in the get method. And then we're going to add this function or this method call onto the object that's returned from that, which we know is of type form, bind from request. So this is a pretty cool method. What it's going to do is it's going to actually look at the HTTP request, that object that's brought in from HTTP land, and it's going to bind the values from that post request, okay, that post HTTP request, to this Java object and return it to us. So now we have this form data object, which is of type form contact form data, but it's filled with the data that the user has submitted from the form. Okay. Now the question is, well, how can we get it? naturally, I guess, what you do is you take that form data object and you call the get method on it, and that returns to you an object of type contact form data, which was our backing class, right? That's the thing we actually want to be able to manipulate in this world of Java. Okay, so the contact form data class is, or this contact form data object is now something we can call, the first name, last name, telephone, accessors on, and print them out if we wanted to. Okay, but of course, in general, you're going to really do something at this point. You're going to persist it to the database. You're going to, who knows what you'll actually do. The point is, now you have access to those strings that user has typed into the page, and you can, run wild at this point. I'm running wild just by printing it out to the console just to see that I've actually got this data. But in general, you're going to do something interesting at this point. And then you want to return some value. And in this case, what I'm going to say is just return the same data that we've created. Okay, so in this case, when you press the add button in this page, you won't see much happen on the page because it's going to redisplay the same data that you just saw. So it'll look the same. And we could fiddle around with this and change these values in some way, and then you'd see the change, and that might be an interesting exercise. But you don't have to do it. Okay, final part of this is that you need to update your routes file in order to indicate to Play that there is this post HTTP request that we want to be able to handle, and otherwise the user will get an error when they try to submit the form. Actually, we'll get a compiler error even before that, but in the case of the routes file, we want to indicate that it's legal for someone to send a post request to this particular URL, and then when they do that, this is the actual method in the controller class that we want to have invoked. Okay? So that's pretty much it. Okay, and thanks a lot. You may want to watch this a few more times, actually, because let me just get back to it, because it is complicated the first time. And again, this is probably a WAD that you want to do a few times until you work through, you see the different kind of compiler errors that you can get, and you understand what you're missing when you did it. That's one reason why I really hope that you do these WADs multiple times and not just trudge through till you get it once. Because you're going to miss, if you don't do it multiple times, you're likely to miss certain kinds of mistakes that you can make while you're in a very protected setting, okay? And can really figure out eventually what that compiler error is actually referring to. If you do that, if you do the WAD multiple times and have come across the different kind of compiler errors just because of making random mistakes at various times, then when you enter situations you're not familiar with, you'll see this compiler error and you think, oh yeah, I remember when I was doing that WAD, I got that error and it was because of this, and you can immediately get the answer. But if you've never come across that compiler error before, you come up with it in a new situation, that it could take a lot longer. Okay, so I really recommend you keep practicing these WADs till you feel real comfortable with it and you understand why it is you're modifying the code, and then we can go on, because there's this is just the very beginning of form processing. There's more complicated kind of forms that we want to be able to deal with, and we want to be able to process the data in certain ways. We want to validate it. And all this stuff is going to, kind of create a more complicated system and more opportunities for things to go in a weird way. So really practice this, get this down, post questions to the mailing list if you don't understand aspects of this. But I think, with a couple hours or so of hacking, you should really feel comfortable with this, and you'll be in a solid place to move on.